What way is human rights an essential part of this crucial debate?
Well, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have done research all over the world. We've seen time and again that if there is no respect for human rights, for human dignity, if there is discrimination of minorities, if there is discrimination in access to services, if for political or religious or other reasons some groups are excluded, there is no basis for development. The two things are linked. And we are critical that in some cases, countries, donors, international organizations are too uncritical in only looking at the macro figures. Behind success, apparent success, there is deep discrimination, there is ruthlessness, and there are violations of human rights.
Is it possible, obviously without, naming the countries, is it possible to give an example of what you've just described?
Well, I would say that a couple of the African nations that have done big strides in realizing Millennium Development Goals and are darlings of the donor communities, are countries where we have reported massive discrimination, massive repression against certain of the groups that do not support the regime. And if there is one lesson of the Arab Spring, really, it is that in the long run, you cannot build development, you cannot build a regime on the basis of discrimination, on the basis of undemocratic repression.
And what are specific examples of human rights as a climate change issue? I mean, one that springs to my mind is Indigenous people perhaps being pushed off their land for some kind of development which doesn't necessarily feed the local economy. Other examples?
Well, in terms of sustainable development, I think the discrimination, alienation, exclusion of indigenous groups is a very good example. The majority population make big progress when there are massive investments in infrastructure and otherwise, and the indigenous people are driven off their land. We've documented how indigenous people have also been driven off their land for industrial agriculture, which means more food security for the majority population, but it means devastation for indigenous people who have been in a place for 1,000 years. In terms of climate change adaptation, it's also very important to know that some of the services, some of the investments are excluded from indigenous groups, from minority groups, from groups who do not support the majority. And we're just very keen on saying to international financial institutions, to UN institutions, to donors, go behind the macro figures, see how it really is done on the grassroots level, and demand accountability, demand justice, demand human rights.
I mean, we're here in Rio 20 years after the first conference to see what progress we've made. I mean, in the previous 20 years, has human rights perhaps not been at the forefront of the debate, has not received as much coverage as it should have done?
Well, first and foremost, we should celebrate the progress that has been there in these 20 years. I know Gro Harlem Brundtland well. She's a fellow Norwegian. I think we should all celebrate that there has been progress in the direction of poverty elimination. There are more people now with education than ever before. There are more people who are fed than ever before. And expectation of life and child mortality have improved dramatically. However, there are too many cases where you only look at those macro figures. So again, what we're saying is, let's also be a little bit critical to look behind this progress and realize that some of these countries are not as good as they look like. I remember on the Human Development Index, after 40 years of progress, the report said they celebrated, among other countries, Tunisia. This was like 3 months before the country exploded because of the people feeling that they had such a very rotten system. And indeed, it was a country that, on the face of it, had made big strides in the direction of more education, better health, development for all, but it wasn't really true.